An immigrant shares her lunch with a homeless man, never guessing he's the mayor in disguise. This simple act of kindness would soon change both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Elena Sokolov clutched her worn canvas bag against her chest as the autumn wind whipped through the city streets, carrying the scent of rain and the whispers of a world still foreign to her even after 8 months in America. Her fingers, chapped from the cleaning chemicals she used at her night job, traced the edge of the carefully wrapped containers inside. Lunch was a luxury she rationed carefully, each portion calculated to stretch her meager paycheck until the end of the month. The park bench was damp from the morning's drizzle, but it was her spot, the only 15 minutes of peace in her 14-hour workday. Elena swept aside a few wet leaves and settled on the edge, her shoulders hunched against the cold. She unwrapped her homemade pierogi, the steam rising in a small cloud that reminded her of her mother's kitchen back in Ukraine, a memory both comforting and painful in its distance. 3 benches away, a man huddled in layers of mismatched clothing, his beard unkempt and his eyes fixed on the ground. Something about his stillness caught Elena's attention. Not the usual restless energy of the city's homeless population, but a profound weariness that resonated with her own. In his stillness, she recognized a kind of invisible exile. She hadn't planned to share today's lunch. Tomorrow was still 3 days from payday, and her cupboard at home held little more than a half-empty box of cereal and some tea. But there was something in the man's posture, dignity beneath despair, that pulled at her. Elena stood, her decision made before her practical mind could object. 5 steps, 10, and she was standing before him, extending half her lunch wrapped in a paper napkin. "Is not much," she said, her accent thick around the edges of her carefully practiced English. "But is warm." The man looked up, and Elena was struck by the clarity in his blue eyes, unexpected islands of light in a weathered face. He hesitated, and for a moment she feared she had offended him. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice surprisingly refined. "That's very kind." Something fluttered in Elena's chest. Recognition, perhaps, though she couldn't place it. She nodded once and returned to her bench, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. What Elena couldn't know was that beneath the layers of carefully cultivated grime and the artfully matted hair was Mayor Robert Whitman, 20 days into his secret project to understand the true state of his city's homeless crisis. What had begun as a political stunt suggested by his campaign manager had evolved into something more personal, more painful, as he navigated the invisible barriers that separated the privileged from the desperate. The pierogi was unlike anything Robert had tasted before, the dough tender, the potato filling seasoned with something he couldn't identify. He ate slowly, watching the woman from the corner of his eye. Her clothes were clean but worn, her posture both tired and vigilant. An immigrant, he guessed, though he couldn't place her accent precisely. Eastern European, perhaps. Elena finished her portion quickly, methodically wiping her hands on a napkin she would later tuck back into her bag to reuse. As she gathered her things, the man called out, "Same time tomorrow?" She paused, surprised. "I sit here every day, yes." "Thank you again," he said, raising the empty napkin like a salute. Elena gave a small nod and hurried away, already calculating how she would stretch tomorrow's lunch for 2. In her tiny studio apartment that evening, Elena stood at her narrow countertop, carefully cutting her portion of cabbage rolls in half. The refrigerator hummed loudly in the background, a constant companion in her solitude. 8 months in America, and still the loneliness felt like a physical presence, sitting heavily on her shoulders as she prepared food for a stranger whose eyes had somehow spoken to her. Perhaps it was foolish, she thought, to share what little she had. Her sister Natasha, safe in Poland with her husband's family, would certainly think so. "America has made you soft," she would say. But America hadn't made Elena soft. It had made her understand the sharp edges of need in a way she never had before. The next day, the rain had stopped, but the cold remained, seeping through Elena's second-hand coat as she approached her bench. The man was already there, his gaze fixed on the duck pond. Today he wore a different hat, still ragged but pulled lower over his eyes. Elena sat beside him this time, leaving a careful distance between them. She unwrapped her cabbage rolls, the aroma of tomato and dill rising between them. "My mother's recipe," she explained, handing him his portion. "From Ukraine." "Ukraine?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "When did you come to the States?" 8 months, 1 week, 3 days. Elena replied, precision a habit from counting down visa days, work permits, rent deadlines. Mayor Robert Whitman, though Elena knew him only as Rob, found himself genuinely curious. As mayor, he'd reviewed countless immigration statistics, but numbers on a page were bloodless things. They didn't carry the weight of this woman's careful counting. The journey held in each precise day. Was it difficult to leave? He asked, then immediately regretted the question as her face tightened. Elena looked down at her food. Some things we do not choose, she said simply. War makes choices for us. They ate in silence after that, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was understanding in the space between them. Two people set adrift by circumstances larger than themselves. As weeks passed, their lunch ritual continued. Elena brought borscht in a thermos, potato pancakes wrapped in foil, dumplings filled with cherries when she could afford the luxury of fruit. Rob, the mayor in disguise, began bringing bread from a bakery he claimed was generous to those who waited by the back door after closing. Elena suspected it was more than that. The bread was too fresh, too carefully selected, but she accepted his contribution to their shared meals without question. What began as charity slowly transformed into friendship. Rob never pressed for details about her past, and Elena never asked why a man who spoke like a professor lived on the streets. There was comfort in their unspoken boundaries, a respect that Elena had rarely experienced since coming to America. My work permit, she announced one Wednesday, her face glowing despite the December chill. It has been approved for extension. 1 more year I can stay? Rob's smile transformed his face, momentarily revealing the handsome features hidden beneath the beard. That's wonderful news, Elena. We should celebrate. Celebrate how? She laughed, the sound rusty from disuse. With extra pickle in our soup? I was thinking something more substantial. He hesitated. There's a Ukrainian restaurant on Camden Street. I've heard the food is good. Authentic. Elena's laughter faded. Restaurant? I cannot. My treat, he said quickly. Please. You've fed me for weeks. How can you? Elena stopped herself, embarrassed to question how a homeless man could afford a restaurant meal. Rob seemed to read her thoughts. I have my resources, he said cryptically. Sometimes things aren't exactly what they seem. Elena should have pressed further, should have questioned the inconsistencies that had been piling up. His educated speech, his occasional slip into authority when discussing city politics, the clean fingernails she'd noticed despite his otherwise disheveled appearance. But the promise of Ukrainian food, real Ukrainian food prepared by someone else's hands, was too tempting to resist. Tomorrow night, he suggested. 7 o'clock? Elena nodded, a bubble of something like happiness expanding in her chest. The restaurant was small, tucked between a laundromat and a convenience store. Elena stood outside, nervously smoothing her only dress, a navy blue cotton sheath that had belonged to her mother. She'd spent an hour trying to make herself presentable, washing her hair in the sink and applying the lipstick she saved for special occasions that never seemed to come. At 7:15, her hope began to waver. By 7:30, it had transformed into a familiar disappointment. Of course he wouldn't come. People made promises all the time, empty words that cost nothing to speak. She turned to leave, her throat tight with unshed tears. Elena! Wait! She turned to see Rob hurrying toward her, but not the Rob she knew. This man was clean-shaven, his hair neatly trimmed, wearing a charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. Only his eyes were familiar, the same clear blue that had first caught her attention. I'm so sorry I'm late, he said, slightly breathless. There was an emergency at... He stopped, taking in her stunned expression. I can explain. Elena took a step back. Who are you? The question hung between them, heavy with betrayal. Around them, pedestrians flowed past, oblivious to the small drama unfolding on the sidewalk. My name is Robert Whitman, he said quietly. I'm the mayor of this city. The world seemed to tilt beneath Elena's feet. The mayor? She had been sharing her precious lunch with the mayor. The absurdity of it struck her first, followed quickly by humiliation. Had she been some kind of experiment? A photo opportunity waiting to happen? I should go, she whispered, turning away. Please don't. His hand caught her elbow, gentle but insistent. Let me explain. Over dinner? Please, Elena. Perhaps it was the familiar way he said her name, or the genuine distress in his eyes, but Elena found herself nodding stiffly, allowing him to guide her into the restaurant. The interior was warm, the walls decorated with embroidered tapestries that reminded her painfully of home. The hostess led them to a corner table, clearly recognizing the mayor but professional enough not to make a fuss. "Why?" Elena asked as soon as they were seated, her voice low and controlled. "Why pretend to be homeless? Why accept food from someone who can barely feed herself?" Robert's face flushed with shame. "It started as a project to understand the homeless situation in the city firsthand. My campaign manager thought a week would be enough for some good press photos." He looked down at his hands. "But then I met you and everything changed." "Changed how?" Elena's voice was brittle. "I've spent my career looking at problems from a distance. Statistics, reports, budgets. But you—" He paused, searching for words. "You showed me what real courage looks like. What generosity means. You had every reason to keep what little you had for yourself, but you shared it anyway. So I was a lesson for you?" The hurt was evident in her voice. "No," Robert said quickly. "At first perhaps I saw you that way. But then I started looking forward to our lunches, to hearing about your day, to trying your mother's recipes. I stopped thinking about being the mayor. I was just Rob sitting with a friend." Elena was silent, absorbing his words, trying to reconcile this polished man with her bench companion. "I should have told you sooner," he admitted. "I just didn't know how without losing what we had." The server approached, and Robert ordered in halting Ukrainian, surprising Elena again. "You speak my language?" "Very badly," he admitted with a small smile. "I've been practicing. I wanted to say thank you properly." Despite her anger, something warm unfurled in Elena's chest. She had not heard her native language spoken by anyone but herself since arriving in America. "Your accent is terrible," she said, but the edge had gone from her voice. Dinner arrived, borscht that smelled exactly like her grandmother's, vareniki with sour cream, tender stuffed cabbage. Elena closed her eyes at the first bite, transported momentarily back to her mother's kitchen, to a time before air raid sirens and hastily packed suitcases. As they ate, Robert told her the truth about his experiment, how it had started as a political strategy but evolved into a personal reckoning, how sleeping in shelters and standing in food lines had changed his perspective on city policies, how meeting her had changed him even more. "I've been drafting a new initiative," he explained, "to streamline work permits for refugees, to create a housing subsidy program specifically for new immigrants." He hesitated. "Your stories, your struggles, they helped me understand what's really needed." Elena studied him across the table, this man who had lived 2 lives. "And now? This dinner is what, goodbye? The experiment is over?" "The disguise is over," Robert corrected gently. "But I was hoping, perhaps we could continue our lunches. Or dinners. As ourselves this time." The vulnerability in his expression was real. The mayor of the city, waiting for her answer like it mattered more than any political poll. Elena thought of her lonely apartment, of meals eaten in silence, of days spent being invisible.
"I would like that,"
she said finally. "But no more lies." "No more lies," he agreed, relief evident in his smile. As winter melted into spring, Elena and Robert's friendship deepened. They met twice a week, sometimes at her bench, sometimes at small restaurants where he introduced her to American foods she'd never tried. He helped her navigate the complexities of her immigration paperwork, while she taught him to make proper Ukrainian borscht in the kitchen of his surprisingly modest home. Elena found work as a translator at a community center, her English improving rapidly with practice and Robert's patient corrections. The position paid better than cleaning offices, and the hours allowed her to take night classes at the community college. Slowly, America began to feel less like exile and more like possibility. For Robert, Elena's perspective transformed his approach to governance. He brought her to community meetings, valuing her direct observations over the filtered reports of his staff. When the city council balked at his proposed immigrant assistance program, it was Elena who stood before them, her story more powerful than any policy paper. "I did not choose to leave my home," she told the council members, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I chose to live. America has always called itself a nation of immigrants. I am asking you to remember this not as history, but as present truth." The program passed by a narrow margin. That evening, as they walked through the park where they had first met, Robert took Elena's hand. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. Elena looked down at their intertwined fingers. "It is strange," she said softly. "When I came here, I thought I had lost everything. My home, my family, my place in the world." She met his eyes. "I never expected to find something new." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. When they pulled apart, the wonder on Robert's face mirrored Elena's own surprise. This hadn't been part of either of their plans. 6 months later, Elena stood nervously in the mayor's office, straightening a framed photograph on the wall, herself and Robert at the opening of the city's first immigrant resource center. Through the windows, she could see the park where a homeless man had once accepted half a lunch from a lonely immigrant. "Are you ready?" Robert asked, adjusting his tie in the reflection of a window. "They're waiting in the press room." Elena took a deep breath. Today, the city would announce her appointment as Director of Immigrant Services, a position created specifically to ensure that newcomers to the city would find support rather than obstacles. Some would call it nepotism, others a political move. Only she and Robert knew the full journey that had led to this moment. "I am ready," she said, smoothing her new blazer, her first, purchased specially for this occasion. As they walked toward the press room, Robert paused. "You know, I never properly thanked you." "For what?" Elena asked, puzzled. "For the pierogi," he said with a smile. "For sharing when you had every reason not to. For seeing the person beneath the appearance." He took her hand. "You changed everything, Elena." "We changed each other," she corrected gently. The cameras flashed as they entered the room, capturing the mayor and the immigrant whose chance encounter had transformed not only their lives, but the lives of countless others in their city. What the photographs couldn't capture was the journey, the cold bench, the shared meals, the gradual dismantling of walls built by circumstance and status. Elena stepped to the podium, her prepared speech crisp in her hands. As she looked out at the gathered press, she thought of her first day in America, lonely, afraid, certain that she would never belong. How wrong she had been. "My story begins with lunch on a park bench," she started, her accent now a gentle lilt rather than a barrier. "With two people who had no reason to trust each other but chose to share anyway." In the back of the room, an aide distributed press packets containing details of the new immigrant initiative. Paperclipped to each folder was a small recipe card, Elena's mother's pierogi, the meal that had started everything. Sometimes the smallest offerings, a meal, a moment of kindness, a hand extended across difference, contain the seeds of transformation. For Elena and Robert, a simple lunch shared between strangers had grown into something neither could have imagined: a partnership, a purpose, and the profound discovery that home isn't always a place, but can be found in the unexpected connections we make along the way. As spring turned to summer, Elena often returned to their bench, sometimes alone, sometimes with Robert. She would watch newly arrived immigrants nervously navigating the park paths and remember her own first days. Occasionally, she would sit beside someone who looked lost, offering a smile, a conversation, sometimes even sharing her lunch. "You never know," she would tell Robert later, her eyes twinkling. They might be the mayor in disguise. And he would laugh, pulling her close, grateful beyond words for the woman who had seen the human being behind the disguise, whose generosity had transformed not just his policies, but his heart.